Hi, my name is Kim Lockhart, and I am thrilled to be here with you today to talk to you about connecting research to classroom practice, effective literacy instruction for second language learners. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself. I am an experienced French immersion teacher. I started my teaching career as an ESL teacher in France, Singapore, and Mexico. I am currently working as a student support teacher at a French immersion school in Kingston, Ontario. I am a board member of the International Dyslexia Association of Ontario, and I last year was hired by the Ontario Ministry of Education as a content contributor. And in that capacity, I helped to rewrite the new Ontario language curriculum that is now an evidence-based curriculum. I am on the Ontario Literacy, the OnLit team, helping to develop content to align with the new Ontario language curriculum. I am also a CERI certified classroom educator. So what I would like to do today is to discuss how I have changed my teaching practice to align with the reading research. When I first started teaching French immersion in 2005, I started with the Ontario curriculum. And the French as a second language curriculum was developed back in 2013. And I want to share with you a little bit about what this curriculum is based on. I've pulled a quote from page 9 of the Ontario curriculum, and it says, "If students can hear it, they can say it. If students can say it, they can read it. And if students can read it, then they can write it." This is a belief system that permeates through many of our curriculum documents, and it still is currently in our French second language document. And so I was teaching based on this belief system that an immersion environment, by simply immersing children in a language-rich environment, they would somehow, through osmosis, through exposure, be able to understand, speak, read, and write in French. However, after several years of teaching, I felt like I was missing 3 or 4 students, and possibly many others, through this teaching approach, that if students can hear it, they can say it. If they can say it, they can read it. And if they can read it, they can write it. So that's when I decided to do my Master of Education, to take a deeper look into how students actually learn to read and write, not just in one language, but in both languages. So what I learned is that actually the reading research says otherwise. So I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about this inclusion model. In Ontario, we have a very inclusive French immersion program. We welcome and embrace students with diverse, with multiple learning exceptionalities. We welcome students with diverse learning abilities. And in our 2015 document, the Ontario Ministry created Including Students with Special Education Needs in French as a Second Language Programs. And this document does a great job of outlining how important it is to believe in students and to believe that they are able to learn a second language. It also emphasizes having a vision, a shared vision amongst educators. And so this vision and this belief guided my teaching practice for many, many years as a classroom educator. But again, I was still missing a cohort of students. So I equate this document to learning to swim. I've got 2 young children of my own, and I believe that my 2 own children, my 2 girls, can be strong swimmers. I want to believe that they will be able to swim in case of emergency, swim for enjoyment. And I have a vision for them too, but that alone wasn't enough. Believing that they could swim wasn't enough to actually allow them the skills to swim. What they needed was explicit instruction on how to hold your breath underwater, how to keep your head above water, how to go into the deep end and swim successfully. And so I make this analogy because sometimes belief systems are not enough. Sometimes we have a vision, a shared vision for all people to be able to swim, just like we have a shared vision for all students to be able to read and to write. But believing and having a shared vision sometimes is not enough. What do students need to be able to read and write proficiently, not just in one language, but in 2 languages? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the human brain was not wired for written print, for written form. In fact, we have to rewire our brains to be able to match speech sounds to printed symbols. Print is actually a fairly new invention that was developed about 5,000 years ago. However, our brains we are born, the human brain is wired for spoken language. From as early as, from birth, the human brain has been wired for spoken language, to understand spoken language and to use spoken language to express thoughts and opinions and to communicate. But for students to be able to learn to read and write, they need explicit instruction to understand how to map those speech sounds to printed symbols. And I created this diagram to show just how complex that can be for our students in French second language programs. Students actually need to learn 2 sets of code. This is the phonetic letter sound associations in order to be biliterate in both languages. The English graphemes are presented in the red, and the French graphemes or letters and sounds are presented on the right. In the middle, the green portion, is some overlap between those 2 sound systems, those 2 letter sound systems. And so parents who do not speak French at home and want to support their students' second language acquisition, I encourage them to really focus on that green portion so that students can transfer that into the classroom, into their reading and writing. So it's important to look at French Immersion in terms of what is this program providing our students? Well, French Immersion is known to be Canada's leading bilingual program that helps students learn to speak and understand the language of French. But also, the prefix bi means 2 languages. So we want to make sure that our students are able to communicate in English as well as in French. But I think it's also really important to define and have a common understanding of the difference between bilingualism and biliteracy. First of all, bilingualism is the ability to learn to speak and understand 2 languages. Like I said, our human brains are wired to learn spoken language through exposure, through immersion. Many of us as parents and caregivers speak to our children as they're growing up in those foundational early years from 0 to 5. And so students come to school with this knowledge of how to communicate through spoken language in their home language. Limited instruction is required for mastery for spoken language. But what is biliteracy? By contrast, biliteracy is the ability to learn to read and write. It is mapping speech sounds to printed symbols or text on the page. And this is not something that the human brain is wired to do, to convert printed symbols to speech sounds and vice versa, converting speech sounds to print, which is spelling. So explicit instruction is required. And if we think about that curriculum document that says if students can hear it, they can say it, they can read it, that actually does not align with the reading research. So what exactly is the reading research? The reading research, or otherwise known as the science of reading, is a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. Now, the science of reading is not a buzzword. It has been used a lot, but essentially it's talking about an understanding of the reading research. And this research is global. It's from across the world, across many different fields of science, including linguistics, cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology, and of course, education science. And using that information and using that reading research to inform our teaching practice. But what does the science of reading or the reading research say about second language acquisition? The reading research has taken place across the world in multiple languages. It is not something only for monolingual English-speaking students. In fact, the document that I just shared with you, the Science of Reading Defining Guide that was created by the Reading League, actually says that second language students benefit from the practices derived from the reading research, or the science of reading. All proficient readers must master the same concepts in order to learn to read. However, it is important to provide students with linguistic differences of focused attention on oral language development. And if you think about it, like I said, students come to school with a solid oral language foundation or some oral language skills in their first language. But our second and multi-language learners are not coming to school with that oral language foundation in a second language. It's the language of instruction will be different than the home language. So we need to make sure that we are building that foundation on oral language to ensure that our students have the building blocks for reading and writing. One of the most important reading research models is called the simple view of reading. And this was developed by Goff and Tunmer in 1986. So again, the reading research has been around for decades. It's not new, it's just new to us as educators. We want to make sure that that reading research is getting into teacher training programs and is getting into faculties of education and is getting into the hands of teachers who can use it to inform their teaching practice. So this model essentially shows that reading comprehension, or the ability to understand printed text, requires two things. It requires it requires the ability to recognize words, to decode words, match speech symbols to those printed match speech sounds to the printed symbols. But it also requires students to be able to comprehend what they read. That is the oral language comprehension piece. As I mentioned, I started my teaching career overseas, and when I was teaching in Mexico, I really wanted to learn Spanish. And Spanish is a very phonetic language. Essentially, each letter has one sound, or each grapheme has one phoneme. So it was very easy for me to learn to decode the printed symbols on a page in a text. However, even though I sounded like a good reader and I was a great decoder, I had no oral language comprehension. I didn't have enough exposure and enough instruction in the language comprehension piece to understand what I was reading. So I could read a passage and sound like a good reader, but when someone said, "Oh, Kim, what did you read?" I would say, "I have no idea." So we need to make sure that our second language students, as well as our students in monolingual programs and English programs, are able to not only decode the words off the page, but are able to understand what they read. So Hollis Scarborough teased out the simple view of reading further and said word recognition is actually quite complex. Word recognition is more than just matching speech sounds to printed symbols. It requires phonological awareness, an understanding of how to blend sounds together, how to segment words and tease them out into their individual units of sound. It also requires decoding and knowledge of the alphabetic principle, that these symbols on a page actually represent speech sounds. It also requires students to be able to have sight recognition, which is the ability to recognize a word automatically and move away from decoding letter by letter to word recognition or sight recognition. Language comprehension is even more complex. It requires background knowledge, and students come into school with various levels of background knowledge. So if students are coming to school with less background knowledge than others, we need, as teachers, to help build that background knowledge. We also need to make sure that we are explicitly and systematically teaching vocabulary to our students, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Language comprehension also requires an understanding of the language structures and how sentences in French differ from sentences and sentence structures in English. We also need our students to have verbal reasoning, being able to make inferences and predictions, but they're not able to do that if they don't have strong background knowledge and vocabulary. And of course, literacy knowledge, which is the print concepts. When all of these strands are woven together, and students can read fluently, and move their cognitive load away from reading and decoding those words sound by sound and reading fluently and starting to read for meaning, will students become proficient readers? So why is this important? Well, the Ontario Human Rights Commission in 2019 launched an inquiry across 8 school boards and all 13 faculties of education across Ontario. And they looked into how reading was being taught in classrooms, as well as how faculties of education were training teachers. And they came out with 157 recommendations to improve the way reading is being taught. And essentially, they concluded that Ontario is not fulfilling its obligations to meet students' right to read. But what does that mean for our French immersion students? Well, the OHRC recognized that they did not look specifically at students in French immersion. However, they did recognize and articulate that the recommendations do apply to our second language learners, our ESL, our English second language learners, as well as our French immersion second language learners. And the inquiry also found that schools are streaming students out of French immersion instead of providing them with the accommodations and interventions so they can remain in the French immersion program. And that quote is found on page 19. So again, we are becoming a more inclusive, a more welcoming program, but our students are drowning. Our students are not, even though we are more inclusive, our students are not receiving the supports and services and interventions that are essential for them to learn to read and write in both languages. So how do we change the way we teach? Structured literacy is a term that was coined by the International Dyslexia Association and is defined as a comprehensive approach to literacy instruction that uses the reading research to inform teaching practice. It is effective for all students and essential for students with reading difficulties as well as dyslexia, a reading disability, a specific reading disability. It is characterized by being systematic. There are systems in place. It's like a blueprint for teachers to create these routines through explicit, systematic instruction. We want students to, we need students to be able to, students need to have it modeled for them. Students need to have that I do, we do, you do systematic approach. It is also explicit. By explicit, I mean it is teacher-directed. The teacher models and tells the students exactly what they need to learn. It is not an inquiry-based approach to reading instruction. It is also sequential, and by sequential, I mean cumulative. It moves from simpler skills towards more complex skills. And it is also diagnostic. By diagnostic, as the reading teacher, we need to constantly be observing and monitoring the progress of students. We need to monitor their progress regularly so that we can not see if they are learning, but to see if our instruction is meeting the student needs. So we want to monitor students' progress to see if our instruction is working. This resource, or the infographic I have here, shows how oral language is at the core of a structured literacy approach, and all of the other components of structured literacy are around it. I love this infographic to illustrate why I have embraced a structured literacy approach in my French immersion classroom. This infographic shows someone shoveling the stairs. Our old language curriculum in Ontario was based on a stairs approach. It worked for some, but not for all, leaving many students behind at the bottom of the stairs. A structured literacy approach, on the other hand, is like a ramp. It provides access for everyone. Not everybody needs the ramp, but it works for everyone. And this is what a structured literacy approach is designed to do. It is designed to meet the needs of all students. Students who are not able to access the curriculum through 3Qing and balanced literacy. This is an approach that works for all students. In fact, research says that a structured literacy approach will be effective, is effective for 95 to 98% of students. So if we are not meeting the needs of students, then we need to change the way we're teaching. As I mentioned, oral language is at the core, at the heart, at the center of a structured literacy approach. The National Early Literacy Panel in 2008 is quoted saying that the ability to produce and comprehend spoken language is one of the earliest predictors of literacy achievement. Our students who struggle with oral language are going to be at higher risk for reading and writing difficulties. So what do I do in my classroom? How do I help ensure that students have that foundation, that core, in order to develop their reading and writing skills? The first thing I do is I consult with my speech and language pathologist. Our speech and language pathologists and our CDAs, our communication disorders assistants, are the experts in oral language. I consult with my SLP to make sure that I have the tools in my toolbox to support my students in the whole class setting, as well as in the small Tier 2 groups. In my small Tier 2 groups, as well as in my kindergarten classroom, I use mirrors to show students what their mouth, lips, teeth, and tongue are doing, show them their mouth position. Unfortunately, because of COVID, many students did not see the mouth position due to mask wearing, and it has greatly impacted students' ability to know the position of their mouth when they articulate speech sounds. Research also tells us that young kids with strong oral language skills have an easier time learning how to read. Conversely, children who have difficulties with listening and speaking tend to have difficulty learning to read and write. So what does that look like in my classroom? In my kindergarten classroom, I have 2 kindergarten classrooms that I teach in. I do a sound sort. I show them the grapheme or the letter, and we decide together, we talk about the characteristics of those speech sounds. Are they stretchy, continuous sounds, or are they stop sounds? And we put them into a Venn diagram. The bubble gum on the left are those stretchy sounds like v, ah, and the circle on the right are those stop sounds, such as b, d, t. And we talk about those characteristics. We also talk about, and I show them, how some sounds are voiced and how some sounds are unvoiced. For example, the sound v, our voices vibrate, whereas the sound f, our voices don't vibrate. Some students need this explicit instruction in turning their voice box on and their voice box off. Some students don't, but it's fun for everyone. Phonemic awareness is an essential skill that provides a foundation for students' ability to manipulate speech sounds and later reading and writing skills. It is an awareness of each of the individual sounds in spoken words, including consonants and vowels. Students must be able to identify speech sounds in words. For example, the word cat has 3 sounds, k, a, t. A lot of students may just hear that one sound, cat, as one. We can explicitly show them how the word cat is actually 3 phonemes or 3 sounds and help them identify those sounds, beginning, middle, and end. Students must also be able to blend sounds together. That is the precursor to decoding and matching those speech letter sounds and blending them together to make words. Students must also be able to segment words, taking a word and teasing it out into its individual speech sounds. That is the precursor to spelling. Students also must be able to manipulate speech sounds orally. If I say the word bat and I change the initial sound b to k, the word is cat. Again, this is moving through a continuum of easier to more complex skills. In my classroom, I focus on sound identification, blending, and segmenting. So what does the phonemic awareness research tell us? Students must be aware of phonemes within words in order to map, sorry, I'm falling behind, in order to map graphemes onto phonemes. Early training of phonemic awareness skills prevents many reading difficulties from happening. And I love this quote because it talks from a prevention standpoint. We don't want to take a wait to fail approach. We want to make sure that we are using and implementing phonemic awareness in our classrooms to help prevent reading failure from happening. One of the classroom practices I do is I teach this to the whole class, and then students who are struggling either with attention and engagement or struggling to understand, I pull them aside, and on the carpet we just do some of the same practice, but in a more intensive way, with more repeated practice for those. So these three who are on the carpet with me, it was snack time, and I brought them over to the carpet just to give them repeated instruction of what we had done as a whole class. And I'm playing a game called Mot Mystère, or Mystery Word, and I would give them three phonemes, such as mat, at, again, at, and then we blend those sounds together, mat. So for some students, this is a tricky task, and for others, it is much easier. For those students who find it difficult, those are the students who need small group, more intensive remediation and practice, and more repeated opportunities to practice it. What is phonics? Phonics is matching the speech sounds to printed symbols, or letter sound correspondence. Typically, I choose recent research to share with people. I deliberately chose an old quote just to show that this research has been around for a long time, longer than I've been around. So I chose this quote to share with you by Jean Chall, back from 1967. And she was quoted saying that early systematic instruction in phonics leads to better achievement in reading than later and less systematic phonics instruction. So we've known this research for a long time, which makes me question, why wasn't in our curriculum? So what does that look like in my classroom practice? In my classroom, I use multiple strategies to help my students with letter sound correspondence and with phonics in French. One of the strategies I use is something called a flip book. And I have the graphemes on 2 sheets of paper. And in the 3-ring binder, I have consonants on one side and vowel sounds on the other side. And I simply switch the grapheme or flip the page to show a different letter, and we blend those sounds together. So we are incorporating both phonics as well as phonological awareness, phonemic awareness skills with that blending factor as well. Again, I do this in the whole class setting. Students who struggle, who are not engaged, who are not able to focus for the lesson, I pull them aside while the other students are working independently on the activity, and I give more intensive practice for those students who need it the most. When we think of, I think I've lost my slides. When we think of spelling, we have to remember that decoding, should I keep going? So when we think of decoding, we often think about looking at those letters and matching them to speech sounds. But we have to remember that phonics is more than looking at those letters and matching them to speech sounds, but it's also speech to print. We need to make sure that our students are able to hear those speech sounds, those phonemes, and be able to map the letter to those phonemes. That is spelling. And what does the spelling research say? It says that children need systematic spelling instruction to learn the writing system and how it works, and not just memorize how words are spelled. One of the evidence-based strategies I use in my second language classroom is something called SOS spelling. And SOS spelling is capitalizing on that phonemic awareness skill, which is segmenting words into their phonemes. So we want to make sure that students are able to hear the speech sounds in a word such as mal. They can hear l, and be able to map the letter M to map the letter A to a, map the letter L to L, and that is the approach that I take to spelling instruction rather than having them memorize whole words. We need to really hone in and capitalize on that sound symbol, that sound system, the phonemic awareness system. We also can't neglect to think about the language comprehension piece of the puzzle. So that was a lot of the decoding word recognition piece, but students must have background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge to understand what they read. Natalie Wexler, who is the keynote speaker for today's conference, as well as the author of the Knowledge Gap, is quoted saying that the most important factor in determining whether readers can understand a text is how much relevant vocabulary or background knowledge they have. I like to use the example of golf. I am not a golfer myself, but my husband is an avid golfer. And the first time he went golfing, he came home and I asked him how he did. And he said, well, I shot 72 and my friend shot 100. And I said, oh, that's too bad. Maybe you'll do better next time. And he was confused. And he said, no, I played very well. I said, but you only got 72. And what was happening was I was using my background knowledge of other sports, of soccer, tennis, baseball. And my understanding was the higher score was the better score, not understanding that in golf it's the reverse. The fewer strokes, the better. So he had to explain that to increase my background knowledge on the sport of golf. I also needed to make sure that I understood the vocabulary because he said he hit a birdie. And I thought, oh my gosh, you've killed a bird. That's terrible. Is it okay? And he said, no, a birdie is hitting 1 under par. At the time, I didn't know what par meant either. But again, my understanding of how he played was heavily influenced by my understanding of the vocabulary. He said he hit an eagle. Again, I thought he hit a bigger bird, but it wasn't. It was actually 2 under par. So we need to make sure that our students understand the vocabulary in a text passage before we give them that text passage, because if they don't understand the vocabulary words such as birdie and eagle, it can drastically impact their ability to comprehend the text. This was actually one of the classic studies done many years ago. And in this classic study called the baseball study, the researchers had 2 cohorts of students. One cohort of students were very strong decoders, but they had no understanding of the sport of baseball. They didn't play baseball. They never watched baseball. They didn't know anything about the sport itself. The second cohort that they looked at had a very strong background knowledge, very strong understanding of the sport of baseball, but they were very weak decoders. And both cohorts read a similar reading passage on baseball. And what they found was that the students who were weaker decoders had poor word recognition skills, but had a strong understanding of the sport, actually did better on a reading comprehension passage than the strong decoders who knew nothing about the sport of baseball. So this just reiterates the importance of building students' background knowledge so that they have a full understanding of the text. What about the vocabulary research? What does vocabulary research say about students reading? This one particular study by Snow, Porch, and Tabers and Harris says that lack of vocabulary knowledge becomes the greatest obstacle to reading comprehension. In Beck, McEwen, and Kuchen's research, they found that, or they show the tiers of vocabulary instruction. And students need to have 3 tiers of vocabulary. They need to have tier 1, which are words of everyday speech, as well as tier 2, which are those high-frequency words, as well as tier 3, which are words that are found in very domain-specific areas. Our students in French Immersion and our other second language learners do not come to school with any tier 1 vocabulary. Our monolingual students who speak English at home and are going to English language programs, they are coming to school already with words in their tier 1 vocabulary bank. So as French immersion teachers, as second language teachers, we need to make sure that we are building that bank of vocabulary words, not just in tier 2 and tier 3, but also in tier 1, that everyday language so that they can communicate and express themselves. One of the classroom strategies I use in both English as well as in French, because I do teach both languages, is using paint strips. And we take simple words and we build on them using synonyms and more complex vocabulary. And we tuck these paint strips into the books so that students can use and refer to these words to give them a better understanding when they read the story, but they can also use these words in their own written compositions. So if they're talking about something that is old, they have a new bank of vocabulary words that are more descriptive, more deep, more complex, and help to develop a better visual picture of what it is they're trying to describe. Fluency is when we thread all of those strands together and weave them together. And there is a lot of research on fluency. One of the research studies says that fluency is accurate reading of connected text at a conversational rate with appropriate prosody. This second quote from Jan Hasbrook and Deb Glazer, who is the creator of the Top 10 Tools for Reading Teachers, says that fluency is reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable expression that leads to accurate and deep comprehension and motivation to read. And I love this second quote because it includes students' motivation to read. Students who read with fluency are going to be more motivated to read and to pick up a book and read for enjoyment. Students who struggle with reading fluency, it's probably because they are still struggling with the decoding piece and matching those letter sounds and having that letter sound correspondence. If they are not reading fluently, they are still going to be struggling readers. And being a struggling reader, they're probably going to be less motivated to pick up a book and read. So what does that look like in my classroom? I use partner reading to help build my French immersion students' reading fluency. So I have two things. I have two students, and I have a template, a script to help them with the partner reading. One student, who is the more fluent reader, will read a reading passage. She will read the reading passage to her less fluent partner. The less fluent reader listens to her partner read and then reads the same reading passage. The more fluent reader makes error corrections. If errors are made, the more fluent reader has a script to help correct those errors, and they repeat the same passage until they build that reading fluency. There is a lot of research on reading fluency by Dr. Matthew Burns, but partner reading is one of the classroom practices that has drastically improved my students' reading fluency in French immersion. The ultimate goal of reading instruction is to make meaning from text. Dr. Louisa Moats, who is an expert in the reading research, says that links between sound, symbol, and meaning must be constructed like a layered cake, systematically and explicitly. And I love this particular example because the magic happens not when students are decoding, when they're mapping the speech sounds to the letters, but the magic happens when they attach meaning to the words. And so my class of kindergarten students last year, we were working through our scope and sequence of phonics and letter sound correspondences. And they were reading, by January, they were reading 64 decodable words. And this student got to the last word and he sounded it out. He was decoding l, u, l, u, lu, lu. And then you saw his eyes light up and he said, Lulu, that's my mom's favorite store. And it just clicked. He was like, that's like Lululemon. And sure enough, his mom loved Lululemon. But decoding isn't enough. Students need to be able to connect those letter sounds and those printed symbols to meaning. And that's when the magic happens. We can't neglect printing. Printing, as I said, is a relatively new invention that has only been around for about 5,000 years. We need to remember that printing is one of the foundational skills, and unfortunately it was taken out of our language curriculum in Ontario, but it is now back in the Ontario curriculum. And it is important to realize that brain research shows that handwriting is extremely important. Handwriting leads to better perception of letters in reading than keyboarding alone. And forming letters might actually help create the letter form in the mind's eye better than selecting them by key press. Printing is one of the classroom practices that I enjoy doing the most with students because we can incorporate that letter sound correspondence as students are printing. Also, it's important to explicitly explain to students that our letter forms move in the same direction that we read, top to bottom, left to right. And reinforcing that directionality in how we print letters will reinforce that directionality when they start to read printed letters. I have been on this learning journey since 2013 when I started my master's and really taking a deep dive into the reading research. It has been an interesting journey with some ups and some downs. But if you are starting your science of reading learning journey, I encourage you to build your community. There are many different ways that you can build your Science of Reading learning community. One way is to start a Science of Reading book club. I started my Science of Reading book club in my district back in 2021 when COVID was really at an all-time high. And I wanted to share the reading research with my colleagues. I wanted to make sure that every classroom teacher has this information and has this knowledge, despite the fact that the curriculum didn't align with the reading research. But now it does. I had so many books from my Science of Reading book club. I wanted to share those books. So I started a Science of Reading lending library at my school so that other educators could pick up a book and learn more about the importance of vocabulary development, learn more about the importance of background knowledge, learn more about dyslexia, what it is and what it is not. Not everyone has time to read long books, so I started a podcast club. And we called it the Listen and Learn Podcast Club. And instead of reading a book each month, we listen to one podcast episode. There are so many great podcasts out there, and it is even more rich experience if you can share and engage in discussions with other colleagues about that podcast. I've also done some charity runs to help raise awareness of dyslexia and bringing awareness to the fact that students with dyslexia and learning difficulties can succeed in a second language program. But it takes more than a belief system. It takes more than just having a shared vision. It takes knowing the reading research and knowing how to implement that and what does it look like in the classroom. And in conclusion, I just want to share with you this image. This is the Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I met Chief Commissioner Patricia de Gruyere at last year's Idea of Ontario conference. And she is quoted saying that knowledge is power, but only if it is shared. So I want to thank you very much for letting me share my knowledge of the reading research and my experience as a classroom teacher using that reading research in my second language classroom. Thank you very much. Okay, awesome.